Here is a fact that most people scrolling past the headlines completely missed. The photograph that ignited this entire controversy, the image of Pastor Adeboye allegedly holding a placard at a protest against a sitting government, was not from 2025, it was not from 2023, and it had nothing to do with the Tinubu administration. The RCCG confirmed it was taken during a prayer walk organized under former President Muhammadu Buhari, a walk initiated not by Adeboye personally, but by the Pentecostal Fellowship of Nigeria as a collective act of intercession. That is the image that has been circulating for weeks as proof of a standard Adeboye is now allegedly betraying. And today, June 4, 2026, Peter Obi, the NDC presidential candidate, and the man millions of Nigerians placed extraordinary trust in just 3 years ago, stepped into this controversy and took a side. His statement has divided Nigerians almost perfectly down the middle. But here is the question nobody is asking. Is this fight actually about Pastor Adeboye at all? Or is it a proxy war about something much bigger, timed for a very specific reason? Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this analysis, you will not see this story the same way you saw it when you clicked. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Inside Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. To understand why Peter Obi's statement landed the way it did, you need to understand what preceded it, and you need to understand the precise sequence of events, because the sequence is everything. It begins not in June, but in late May 2026. Between the 30th and 31st of May 2026, a series of videos began circulating on social media. The individuals in those videos, several of whom identified themselves as RCCG members, made a specific claim that a peaceful protest focused on insecurity, a protest they believed was being organized with the church's tacit support, had been called off. They did not allege this quietly. The video spread rapidly, and within 48 hours, the narrative had hardened into something that looked on the surface like a proven fact. The backdrop to this is critical. Nigeria in May and June 2026 is a country living under acute security pressure. On the 3rd of June, just one day before Obi issued his statement, gunmen abducted the sister of former Power Minister Adeboye along with her twin sons in Ibadan, Oyo State. That single incident, carrying the names of the powerful and the innocent in the same sentence, struck a nerve that was already raw. Into this environment, the accusations against Adeboye did not need much oxygen to burn. The claim was simple and emotionally potent. A man who once stood against a government when it was Jonathan is now silent, or worse, complicit when it is Tinubu. On the 2nd of June, RCCG issued a formal response, and it was categorical. The church stated that no protest was ever planned or cancelled by Adeboye. What occurred, it explained, was a communication from the Pentecostal Fellowship of Nigeria to RCCG members about adjustments to a centralized prayer program. The church's language was precise. Adeboye had communicated an institutional instruction. He had not, the church insisted, suppressed civic action. The church went further. It stated that Adeboye had spoken consistently on insecurity, governance, economic hardship and governance, but that his chosen mode of engagement is moral guidance and prayer, not partisan street protest. RCCG closed its statement with a pointed rebuke of what it called agenda-driven narratives. Then, the day after, on June 3rd, evangelist Mike Bamiyole, founder of Mount Zion Faith Ministries, entered the conversation on Instagram. His position was unambiguous. Expecting an 84-year-old man to lead a street demonstration against the government is unreasonable, full stop. He also clarified that the 2020 event, the one most commonly cited as evidence of Adeboye's past protest leadership, was a CAN and PFN collective initiative, not a personal political statement by Adeboye. And then came June 4th, Peter Obi. In a post published on his X account on Thursday morning, Obi did not hedge. He named Adeboye directly, he defended him directly, and he pointed a finger, carefully but unmistakably, at what he called the same forces he observed dividing Nigerians after the 2023 elections in Lagos. The statement was measured, but the timing, the framing, and the political context surrounding it ensured that nothing about its reception would be measured at all. In a moment, I will show you exactly how Obi's statement this week fits a pattern he has been building for months and what it reveals about where he believes the 2027 battle will actually be fought. But first, let us go to the institution at the center of this story. The institution we need to examine here is not INEC, it is not the EFCC, it is not even the presidency. The institution at the heart of this controversy is the Pentecostal Fellowship of Nigeria, the PFN, and, more broadly, the structure of organized Christianity in Nigerian public life. Understanding how this institution works is essential to evaluating every claim that has been made this week. The PFN is the umbrella body that coordinates the major Pentecostal denominations in Nigeria. It operates in close coordination with the Christian Association of Nigeria, CAN, which itself represents Christians across denominational lines to the government and the public. These are not passive organizations. In moments of national crisis, Boko Haram escalations, election disputes, economic meltdowns, CAN and PFN have historically spoken and acted as coordinated voices. Adeboye, as General Overseer of the RCCG, does not operate as a solo political actor. When he communicates to his membership, he often does so as a conduit for these institutional positions. When RCCG says that the prayer program adjustment was a PFN directive, not a personal Adeboye decision, that is not a deflection. That is how this institution actually functions. Now, why does this matter to the protest controversy? Because the accusation against Adeboye assumed a model of religious leadership that does not reflect how the RCCG's general overseer actually sits within the Nigerian Pentecostal structure. Critics demanded that he act as an autonomous protest leader. The institution he leads does not grant him that role unilaterally. Or, if it does, it has historically not been exercised in that way in relation to any single administration's policies. This is the deliberate ambiguity that critics and defenders have both exploited. Critics ask, why is Adeboye's institutional caution applied unevenly? Was he this restrained under Jonathan? The RCCG and its defenders answer, the 2020 event you are citing was a CAN and PFN collective initiative, not a personal protest leader by Adeboye. You are comparing different categories of action. And here is where the institutional analysis becomes genuinely uncomfortable for both sides. The RCCG's claim that it has spoken on insecurity, governance, and economic hardship is verifiable. Adeboye issued a video as recently as June 3, 2026, calling on the Tinubu administration to issue a 90-day ultimatum to service chiefs to eliminate terrorism or resign. That is not silence, that is a specific time-bound demand directed at a sitting government security leadership. But critics are not simply pointing to silence, they are pointing to a specific comparison between administrations, and that comparison, whether fair or not, carries serious political weight in a country where the religious identity of the president is a live and sensitive variable. Peter Obi understands this better than most. In 2023, he ran a campaign that lived and died by the question of whether Nigerians Christians could trust a southern Christian candidate over a northern Muslim one. The Obi coalition was, among other things, a religious coalition. And today, in 2026, when he defends Adeboye against accusations of pro-Tinubu bias, he is speaking into and about that same fault line. One more institutional thread demands attention: the role of social media as an institution in its own right. The story of the cancelled protest did not originate from a press conference or a verified document. It originated from viral videos that themselves became the evidence. within Nigeria's fact check, published on June 1, 2026, noted that the narrative structure had transformed within a 48-hour window from individual testimony to collective political claim without a single official document ever confirming that a protest had been formally planned, let alone formally cancelled. That is not to say the people who made those videos were lying. Some may genuinely have believed they were preparing for a protest, but the institutional failure here was the speed at which a social media narrative, emotionally resonant, politically useful, was treated as established fact before any verification had occurred. And Peter Obi, in his June 4th statement, is implicitly responding to that institutional failure as much as he is responding to Adeboye's critics directly.
Now, we arrive at the layer of this story that most analysis has refused to enter, and it is the layer that explains why Peter Obi's statement was not simply a pastoral defense of an elder statesman of the Nigerian church. Let us begin with the most direct political question: who benefits from this controversy? The attack on Adeboye, reduced to its essential logic, is an attempt to establish a clear moral narrative ahead of 2027 that the RCCG's General Overseer, the single most influential Pentecostal Christian voice in Nigeria, has either been captured by the Tinubu administration or is too enfeebled by age to resist it. If that narrative holds, it creates a vacuum. It invites Nigerians, particularly Christian Nigerians, particularly those from the southwest and southeast, to redirect their political and spiritual loyalty towards a candidate who is willing to confront power directly. Who is the candidate best positioned to occupy that space? The answer in the current political landscape is Peter Obi, which is exactly why Obi's decision to defend Adeboye rather than distance himself from this controversy is the strategically sophisticated move. Consider what Obi did not do. He did not remain silent, which would have allowed the narrative to run and potentially gain him passive benefit from the anti-Adeboye anger. He did not amplify the criticism, which would have made him look opportunistic and potentially alienated the significant portion of his own base that respects Adeboye deeply. Instead, he defended Adeboye, and in doing so, he communicated something specific to the Nigerian electorate. I do not play those games. I am not the candidate who will exploit your faith to build my coalition. That is a message designed not for his opponents. It is designed for the obedient movement's intellectual core, the credibility-conscious segment of his base that grew tired in 2023 of the campaign's more tribal edges and stayed anyway because they believed in the candidate himself. But Obi's statement did something else. It issued a warning, and the warning was as political as the defense was pastoral. Obi drew an explicit line between what is happening now in June 2026 and what happened in Lagos in March 2023, the period between the presidential and governorship elections, when, as he put it, conversations about competence and governance were hijacked by ethnic sentiment and tribal suspicion. He said with notable directness that similar efforts are now re-emerging, sometimes in more subtle and sophisticated ways. That is not a general observation, that is a political diagnosis, and the diagnosis names a method, not an individual. Now, ask, who deploys that method? Who benefits in 2027 from ensuring that the Southern Christian electorate is fragmented, inflamed, and incapable of uniting around a single opposition candidate? The answer to that question is not a person, it is a structural political interest, specifically the interest of any coalition seeking to prevent a repeat of the 2023 opposition consolidation in the southeast and southwest, where Obi performed historically and where the Labour Party fundamentally changed what was considered possible in Nigerian electoral politics. Obi's statement implicitly says, I see the architecture, I name it, and I refuse to be used in it. Now, look at the voices who are conspicuously absent from this conversation. Where is the All Progressives Congress? Where is the formal Tinubu administration's response to the RCCG controversy? The presidency has been largely quiet, and that silence is calculated. An administration under attack on the question of insecurity has no interest in amplifying a controversy that ties its name to one of Nigeria's most respected religious figures. Better to let the church speak for itself and wait for the storm to pass. Where is the PDP? The formal opposition has issued no unified response. That absence tells you something about the party's inability to convert public anger into disciplined political messaging, a structural weakness that has plagued it since 2023. And where is the Labour Party itself, the vehicle Obi rode in 2023? Obi now heads the NDC. That transition is itself a political statement, and in the context of this controversy, his NDC platform is the one publicly taking a position on what kind of politics Nigeria needs ahead of 2027. The second and third order consequences of this moment deserve careful attention. If Obi's defense of Adeboye is received well, and early indicators suggest it is generating significant support among older church-going Nigerians who were already in his coalition, it consolidates his position as the credible, non-incendiary opposition voice heading into the 2027 cycle. If it generates backlash from younger Nigerians who see his defense as a deflection from the genuine anger over insecurity, it risks reopening the generational fault line that ran through the obedient movement in 2023. The tension between the youth-driven, protest-ready wing of the opposition and the older, institutional credibility wing of the coalition. That tension is not resolved, and this controversy is one of the stress tests that will determine which wing of the opposition consolidates around which candidate or candidates before 2027. Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything. Coming up, I will address the strongest argument from the other side, because the people who are angry at Adeboye are not wrong about everything, and if you take only one thing from this analysis, it should not be the political chess, it should be the real question underneath all of it. Let us pull back from the political chessboard and ask the question that matters to the 133 million Nigerians living below the poverty line, the people furthest from the decisions being made in Abuja and the studios of Naija Insight Desk. What does any of this actually mean for the country? The first implication is structural, and it runs deeper than any single news cycle. Nigeria is approaching its most consequential election since 2015. The 2027 cycle will be contested in a context of compounding crises, a security emergency that has seen armed groups operating with increasing territorial confidence across the Northwest, North Central, and parts of the South, an economy under severe pressure from the Naira's continued instability and the withdrawal of the fuel subsidy, and a governing coalition that has spent its political capital faster than any administration since the return to democracy in 1999. In that environment, the question of who controls the emotional and institutional loyalty of Nigerians' Christian electorate, approximately half the country, is not a minor political variable. It is, potentially, a deciding one. The Adeboye controversy is a preview of how that battle will be waged, and the fact that social media was the primary theater of the first major engagement should alarm every serious political observer in this country. We are 3 years from having an election shaped by a viral photograph that was misidentified, misattributed, and weaponized within 48 hours. The implications for federal-state dynamics are less direct but worth naming. Insecurity in the Nigerian constitutional arrangement is a federal responsibility. The pressure on Adeboye to lead or endorse a protest was at its core a pressure on a civil society actor to do what the state has failed to do: hold the federal executive accountable in a visible, disruptive way. That is a remarkable displacement. When citizens look to their pastor to perform the accountability function because they no longer believe their elected representatives will do, something fundamental has broken in the relationship between the state and the governed. On the economic front, the Oyo abduction of June 3, the kidnapping of a former minister's relatives, is precisely the kind of event that registers in the risk calculus of foreign investors. Nigeria's investment climate cannot survive a perception that armed groups can target the families of prominent figures with impunity. The Naira, already under pressure, does not need another headline that confirms institutional fragility. Every week this security crisis goes unaddressed at a structural level is a week in which the cost of capital for Nigerian businesses rises. The security implications beyond the investment dimension are stark. When civil society figures, religious, civic, or otherwise, are publicly accused of being captured by the government, and when those accusations spread to millions before any verification occurs, the space for genuine civil society advocacy shrinks. Actors who might otherwise speak will calculate the reputational risk of being misquoted, clipped, and virally accused before their full message can reach the public. That chilling effect on legitimate dissent is a gift to any administration seeking to avoid accountability. For the 133 million living below the poverty line, the insecurity crisis is not an abstraction. The 70 school children abducted in Kaduna this year, the Zamfara communities emptied by banditry, the Middle Belt farmers who have abandoned land their families farmed for generations. These are not statistics on a graph. They are the concrete evidence of a governance failure whose human cost is measured in displacement, trauma, and starvation. None of that gets resolved by deciding whether Adeboye should lead or endorse a protest, but the intensity with which Nigerians are debating his role is a measure of how desperate the search for accountability has become in the absence of functioning institutional channels to deliver it.
This section will be shorter than others, because the international dimension of this story is real but indirect. It operates primarily through the lens of pattern recognition, and that lens is currently focused very closely on Nigeria. For the African Union and for ECOWAS, the Nigerian church controversy is not itself a diplomatic concern, but it is a symptom of a dynamic that both bodies are monitoring with increasing unease: the erosion of civilian institutional trust in West Africa's most populous democracy. Nigeria is not Burkina Faso. It is not Mali. But the conversation in Abuja among security analysts and regional observers is not about whether Nigeria is likely to experience a coup. It is about whether the conditions that make a country ungovernable, a crisis of security legitimacy, a fractured civil society, a governing class perceived as indifferent to mass suffering, are accumulating faster than they are being addressed. In the United Kingdom and the United States, where Nigeria's diaspora is large, politically active, and economically connected to the homeland, the Adeboye controversy is being processed through a particular filter. For many diaspora Nigerians, the question is not theological. It is Nigeria capable of producing accountability before 2027? Or will the same structural manipulation that produced the 2023 outcome simply repeat itself with updated tactics? Peter Obi's core support base, built substantially in diaspora communities, is watching his June 4th statement closely. His positioning on this issue will be interpreted not simply as a comment on Adeboye, but as a signal of how he intends to campaign in the 2027 environment he is currently reading. The global pattern worth naming is this: the instrumentalization of religious figures for political ends is not a uniquely Nigerian phenomenon. From Hungary to Brazil to the United States, the deliberate cultivation of religious grievance as an electoral mobilization tool has become a signature feature of populist politics in the 21st century. Nigeria's opposition politicians, whether on the left or the right of the ideological spectrum, would do well to name that pattern explicitly, because the alternative is to become unwitting participants in exactly the dynamic they claim to oppose. Now, I will do what most commentary on this topic has refused to do. I will make the strongest possible case for the people who are angry at Adeboye, and I will make it fairly before I offer the counter. The Steelman argument looks like this: Nigeria is in a genuine security crisis. Hundreds of people are being killed, abducted, and displaced every month. The RCCG has millions of members across all 36 states, many of them in the communities most directly affected by this violence. Pastor Adeboye commands a moral authority that no elected politician in Nigeria currently possesses. When a figure of his stature speaks on governance, it carries weight that the presidency, NAS, and the judiciary collectively cannot generate on their own. The argument continues: religious leaders in moments of moral national emergency have a responsibility that goes beyond their institutional role. Archbishop Tutu Tutu did not confine himself to spiritual counsel during apartheid. The Catholic Church in Nigeria has issued pastoral letters that read as direct political interventions. The Nigerian church historically has not been passive in the face of injustice, and the argument that Adeboye is too old to lead a protest rings hollow when the same argument is never made about elderly political leaders who continue to hold and exercise executive power well past the age of 84. That is the strongest version of the criticism. It deserves to be heard, not dismissed. Now, the counter. The primary factual misconception circulating on social media is the one I named in the hook. The photograph of Adeboye at a protest was not from a protest against any government. It was a prayer walk coordinated by CAN and PFN under Buhari. Using it as evidence that Adeboye has applied inconsistent standards across administrations is, to put it plainly, using fabricated evidence to support a real argument. And that is a problem regardless of whether the underlying argument has merit. The second misconception is the conflation of silence with complicity. Adeboye issued a video on June 3rd demanding that the Tinubu administration gives service chiefs a 90-day ultimatum to eliminate terrorism or resign. That is the language of a man who has made his peace with the status quo. Disagreeing with his method of engagement, prayer and moral counsel rather than street protest, is legitimate. Claiming he has been silent is factually wrong. The third misconception is perhaps the most politically consequential. The idea that Obi's defense of Adeboye is itself evidence of political alignment with the establishment. Some critics on social media have interpreted his statement as a defense of the church hierarchy rather than a defense of democratic discourse. This interpretation requires ignoring the central thrust of Obi's argument, which was not Adeboye is right, but rather stop using religion and ethnicity as political weapons. What nuance is being lost in the noise? The anger driving this controversy is legitimate. Nigerians are terrified. They are watching their country deteriorate and they are searching for someone, anyone, with genuine moral authority to hold the powerful accountable. That anger is righteous, but the specific target of that anger, Adeboye, is partly a proxy for the government he is being accused of protecting. And the manipulation of that anger, if it occurs, benefits the very forces that produced the conditions generating the anger in the first place. What does this mean for Nigeria's democratic trajectory? It means that the conversation Nigerian civil society desperately needs about security, accountability, institutional reform, and the conditions for a credible 2027 election is at risk of being permanently substituted by a conversation about personalities and religious optics. Every hour spent debating whether Adeboye should lead a protest is an hour not spent scrutinizing the security architecture, the defense budget, the state police debate, and the structural failures that have allowed armed groups to operate with impunity for years. That substitution is not accidental. Someone benefits from it. The question is whether Nigerians young especially, who are the generation with the most to lose and the most to gain, will identify the sleight of hand before 2027. Let me give you the 3 most likely next moves from the key actors in this story and what to watch for in the coming weeks. First, Adeboye and the RCCG. The church has made its institutional position clear, and it is unlikely to revisit it. Expect Adeboye to maintain his approach of moral pressure through formal channels, statements, sermons, and institutional advocacy, rather than street-level political mobilization. The more important signal to watch is whether the PFN and CAN issue a coordinated statement on insecurity in the coming weeks. If they do, it will be evidence that the church hierarchy is sensitive to the credibility pressure this controversy has created, and that they are seeking a way to demonstrate moral engagement without individual leaders being exposed to political manipulation. If they do not, it will confirm that the default institutional posture is retreat, and that will have consequences for the church's moral authority heading into 2027. Second, Peter Obi and the NDC. Obi has positioned himself as the credible, non-inflammatory opposition voice. The strategic question for his team is whether this positioning is sufficient to consolidate an opposition coalition that is still fragmented following the 2023 outcome. Watch for 2 specific signals. First, whether the Labour Party formally responds to Obi's statement, either in agreement or in differentiation. The Labour Party's silence or response will be a measure of whether Obi and his former party are converging or diverging on the 2027 opposition strategy. Second, whether Obi's statement generates a measurable shift in his polling in the southwest.
His defense of Adeboye is an implicit outreach to Yoruba Christians who respect the RCCG's general overseer, but who, in 2023, voted for Tinubu in large numbers. If those voters are now open to Obi, this statement may be the first evidence of that movement. The third, the Tinubu administration. The administration's best-case scenario is that this controversy consumes opposition energy for another 2 to 3 weeks and then subsides, leaving the security crisis politically attributed to civil society fragmentation rather than government failure. Its most dangerous scenario is a coordinated church response, CAN, PFN, and individual pastors issuing unified demands that create a moral accountability moment no governing coalition can survive heading into an election year. The 90-day ultimatum Adeboye issued to service chiefs is worth watching. If that deadline passes with no action and no official response, the clemic's credibility will require him to follow up. What that follow-up looks like will define the administration's religious flank for the remainder of this electoral cycle.
Under what conditions does this escalate? If another major security incident, particularly one involving a prominent figure or a large-scale mass casualty event, occurs in the next 60 days, the pressure on religious and civil society leaders will intensify exponentially. In that environment, the demand that Adeboye personally lead public opposition will return louder and harder to dismiss. And the political actors who have positioned themselves on either side of this controversy will have to decide whether their current positions can hold. Under what conditions does it de-escalate? If the Tinubu administration delivers even a partial, visible security response, the arrest of a major bandit commander, the recovery of abducted children, a credible security summit with actionable outcomes, the pressure on religious figures as proxy accountability actors will reduce, not disappear, reduce. The 12-month and 3-year outlook. In 12 months, this controversy will be remembered as one of the opening moves in what will become a sustained battle over the moral authority of the Nigerian church in an election year. The 2027 election will not be free of religious framing. The question is whether that framing is used to fracture the opposition or to hold the governing coalition accountable. In 3 years, looking beyond the 2027 outcome, whatever it is, the deeper structural question is whether Nigeria can develop civil society institutions capable of holding government accountable without routing that accountability demand through religious leadership, with all the manipulability and fragility that such routing entails. The answer to that question is the answer to whether Nigeria's democracy matures or merely cycles. At the start of this video, I asked you whether this fight is actually about Adeboye or whether it is a proxy war about something much bigger, timed for a very specific reason. Here is the answer. This is not primarily about Adeboye. It never was. It is about who controls the moral narrative of Nigerian politics in the run-up to 2027. It is about whether the legitimate, urgent, righteous anger of Nigerians over insecurity, economic devastation, and institutional betrayal can be channeled into disciplined political accountability, or whether it will be fragmented, exploited, and burned before it can produce any structural change. Peter Obi's statement is, at its core, an attempt to prevent the second outcome. You may agree with his intervention, you may believe he is protecting an establishment figure who should be held to a higher standard. Both of those positions are defensible. But the thing that is not defensible, the thing that requires direct confrontation regardless of your political alignment, is the use of fabricated evidence, misattributed photographs, and engineered social media outrage as tools to shape a 200 million person democracy. Nigeria is too important and too fragile for that. The thread I leave with you is this. Obi is now running under the NDC banner. He has staked a credibility claim in this controversy that will be tested by every subsequent position he takes. If his 2027 campaign maintains this standard, analytical, evidence-grounded, and resistant to tribal and religious manipulation, it will be something genuinely new in Nigerian presidential politics. If it does not, this statement will look in retrospect like a performance. Which one it is, that is the question worth watching. If this analysis gave you clarity,
not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.